Fred actually gave a really good overview of what the Pacific Islands Fish and Wildlife Office does, but what our specific division within PIFWA does is, well, we essentially attempt to be the analysts behind informed management decisions. And I say attempt because, as many of you know, that's not always the case. And a lot of times we work with a lot of different types of data. They can be genetic, geographic, demographic, and it's really fun. And we attempted to analyze it to the best of our ability or to the nth degree, whichever comes first. Some representative SHC projects include the How Much Is Enough project, which Fred presented this morning. Demographic, geographic, and even sound modeling for Mariana's kingfisher, which is pretty cool. Publication we conducted on invasibility of the archipelago, or island-wide invasibility around the archipelago. Nihoa finch population genetics, which interestingly mirrors the last talk. It attempts to inform translocation. Native snail distribution and ecosystem modeling. Recently, we published a paper with collaborators from PIXI, Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative, and USGS on Hawaii's forest bird distributions, current and future. It's a rather sad, it was fun to do, but a rather sad output. Essentially, quite a few of them are going extinct in the relatively near future. And because of that paper, we've then got into avian malaria modeling, and Josh Fisher, we're working in conjunction with Josh Fisher, at least trying to inform him in some ways, for controlled strategies and strategies of avian malaria in Hawaii and how to develop those procedures. But one of the most contentious and complex, but also representative issues that I've currently dealt with in my short time in the PIFWA or SHC is modeling the demographic and geographic variance of Newells Shearwater. And I'll get into why. Newells Shearwater is a colonial breeder in mountainous regions. Approximately 90% occur on Kauai, and this is mainly because mongoose doesn't occur on Kauai. They arrive and depart actually crepuscularly, but they feed nocturnally. And they're a case-selected species and produce about 1 egg per year. They face many invasive threats, including habitat modification due to different invasive plants, but also directly from predation. Pigs actually predate both the adults and the young, as we learned a couple of years ago. But the contentiousness actually comes from multiple HCPs relating to power line strikes. These power lines, these transmission lines, essentially act as large nets that these birds strike at night, and then they either die or continue on. And light fallouts. The fledglings are actually, like turtles, kind of attracted to light sources, and it's one of the reasons they can't play football at night on Kauai, because they're actually attracted to the lights from the football game. So when I got into modeling this, I'm trying to understand this and modeling, and I essentially listed some objectives for the approach. And I started in 2012 and went through many different iterations. But this is how I kind of listed it out, and this is essentially the map of the talk as well. I initially wanted to understand the distribution of light fallout around Kauai, and then looked at power line strikes around Kauai, and then combined all of these threats into a current and future population viability assessment. And then, given that, how do we manage for these threats? Like we understand the threats on the colony, and we understand how they're going to how it's going to affect the future populations. But how do we manage for those threats to prevent extinction? But first, I'll get into the light visibility model. So what we did was essentially, and I couldn't have done this without my collaborators at the Hawaiian Endangered Species, or Seabird Recovery Project, who collected all this information and are truly innovative and have conducted a heroic effort for collecting much of the information. And yeah, without them, I could not have done any of this modeling, to tell you the truth. But using points they collected around Kauai for seabird in seabird colonies, we extracted locality information from those points and used that information to extract essentially a light source map, or a light source distribution, which you can see in the gray plot on the left. This is essentially showing light intensities as defined in a box plot. We used that to define a threshold from which we could project light into the environment, essentially to project it over the topographic plane. The yellow is essentially that light intensity as graphed in a box plot for the complete island, for essentially all of the pixels in that island. You'll notice that Oahu is quite out there. One when we do this, when we develop this light viewshed assessment from this threshold, we're essentially projecting into these areas in which seabirds either fly in over or our colonies are breeding in. And we were able to actually link that information back to the Save Our Shearwaters data, demographic or mortality and striking or light fallout information associated with a strategy for recovering seabirds and recuperating those seabirds. So this is the Kauai light viewshed assessment, but for comparison, this is the Oahu light viewshed assessment. You'll notice that the dark images there, that's essentially where there are little to no lights, whereas the red is essentially 100% lit areas. There we go. So after understanding the degree of light fallout and the distribution of lights around Kauai and then the other islands, we then looked at power line strikes around Kauai and developed a strike model. So I know this, a colleague of mine mentioned that this looks more like a seagull, but this is supposed to be a Newells Shearwater. So essentially what these birds do, they hit the line and a strike sound is actually made on the lines. The KSRP, the Kauai Endangered Species Recovery Program, or Seabird Recovery Program, actually developed an innovative approach in which they collected these strike sounds using microphones situated on the poles. Then with conservation metrics, they developed an algorithm in which they could suss out those strike sounds. Using that information, essentially the strikes per line is randomly collected throughout the power line segments, we then linked a set of covariates to those specific line types, either that were those covariates were either collected during the collection of that information, or they were collected via, or they were applied to that section via GIS approach, and developed a power line strike model. Now, this model is one of many, and it varies significantly, but given various correction factors, the number of strikes can be anywhere between 5 to 16,000, and this could be multiple strikes as well. And obviously, we were able to link those strikes to certain demographic variables and such as mortalities and crippling bias as well. Using that information, we then attempted to develop a future population viability assessment, and this population viability assessment is actually geographically enabled, which I thought was pretty neat and fun. But we incorporated a set of other variables into that as well, one of them being climate change. And the way climate change actually affects these seabirds is not directly through temperature modification, but actually through the frequency of extreme weather events and the change in that frequency. So we first modeled the probability of an extreme weather event occurring at a certain pixel or a certain location on Kauai, and then projected that probability into the future for given a certain frequency that we knew that was going to be happening in the next 100 years. And this is the output of those that frequency estimate combined with refugia areas on Kauai. We also looked at depredation variance due to slope, specifically for ungulates and cats. And really, it doesn't vary that much unless you have like a 90-degree slope, a vertical wall. But we were able to apply this over a geographic plane to multiple colonies that are distributed throughout Kauai. But we actually couldn't link all the threats back to the colonies unless we developed some sort of a flight path assessment, which we did. We were able to develop a flight path assessment by varying the degree to which elevation affects the least cost path from the colony to the coast and back. We then validated it using metrics, essentially seabird sightings, seabird flight sightings, and compiled that information to an overall single assessment, weighting it based on that validation metric, which you'll see on your left. This analysis in general took about 3 to 5 weeks to run on a 32-core system with 128 gigabytes of RAM. We recently were able to acquire time at the USGS supercomputer, which was excellent. I mean, we're able to apply it and get an output within 9 hours at a similar resolution and a similar number of points along the coast. So as scientists, of course, we decide to increase the resolution of the analysis and run it for longer. So that's what we're doing now, actually. So these are some of the outputs for that. These are models within models within models, and each of them we attempt to validate, but I'm not showing a lot of those different validation metrics or procedures. I just want to show you the outputs for that. One of those models being the projected population size in multiple colonies situated throughout Kauai. But this, one of the metrics that essentially is, thank you, that is showing the threat, the strike threat on each of the colonies, we were able to link through the flight path assessment, the strikes to each of the colonies. You'll notice that strike effect is less on the northwest portion versus in the interior, in which there's the power lines, the transmission lines are essentially situated along the coast in this area. Light effect essentially mimics that for the colonies. This is the variance in light and strike effect, which we were also able to include into the model. This is slope, the variance in predation is associated with that, and the extreme weather event impact assessment per colony. This is not that extreme weather event impact assessment that was projected into the future, but rather the assessment that was current and then it was applied, the future frequency was applied into the future, given a linear trend. And from that, we were actually able to develop a site-by-site population viability assessment. Now, my colleague, specifically Josh Fisher, said that these slides were rather boring, but I think it's actually somewhat important to show you that each of these colonies has one of these graphics associated with it. And this graphic is a compilation of, 16 iterations, or 16 assessments, 500 iterations per, so it takes quite some time to run. Those assessments actually are varied. The reason they're varied is because they're varied by the threat status. So, for instance, in the upper left-hand corner, I have no power line strikes. Essentially, I remove the effect of power line strikes on that colony, but you still see a decline, versus this is a high power line strike colony. Something to point out about this population, this colony, is that this is on the northwest portion. So power line strikes really show no effect in that area. This is another population. And another, you see the variance in no power line strikes versus high power line strike effect. And what is actually pretty cool about this approach, though, again, variation in power line strike effect and light fallout. Light fallout was also varied for each of these graphics. So what is cool about this is actually you can take these approaches, because given that they were developed essentially over the geographic plane, and apply them to each of those colonies and kind of depict them in that way. And I think, at least, this kind of gives a good, a more intuitive metric of what's going on in the population, at least the meta-population throughout Kauai. For instance, you'll see the lambdas in the northwest portion are higher because they don't interact with power lines or lights, versus the ones here, which have to fly over power lines and into lights. This is what it looks like, actually, when you graphic using a histogram. These populations are more associated with the northwest portion. These more so with those that actually have to fly over those those strike and light areas. And this, given that this is a population viability, you can assess extirpation period. For each of these models, this was done. This is kind of a midpoint model. For all of the models, I didn't get a maximum extra years until extirpation, and it was the maximum I got was about 45 years, which means that they will likely either have an extremely low level population size or may go extinct by year 45. For this population assessment, it was about 35 years. So how do we manage those threats? For that, I've actually developed two pieces of software, one being a replacement calculator, the other being a social attraction site estimator. The replacement calculator is primarily covers the meta-population. It's not very site-specific, but what it does is it attempts to include all the mitigation assessments or all the mitigation that you would like to do on that meta-population, and then include that into a demographic assessment and project that into the future. And then from that, you can actually assess how that mitigation affects the deficit that for instance, the strikes are causing, whether it replaces it or not. Whereas the site-specific social attraction estimator, I don't know if many of you are familiar with the social attraction sites. Social attraction is essentially they build a predator exclusion fence. They put a big, something to attract seabirds in that fence, and then you're essentially building a colony based on that. So again, the replacement calculator assesses mitigation scenarios as applied over the metapopulation, whereas the social attraction site, it essentially looks at a sink without depredation and assesses how that sink grows. Both of these efforts given that they're applied over the metapopulation or site-specific, are initial efforts. They are deterministic estimates of this mitigation effort on that system. They then can be applied back to the more stochastic metric that we went through before. So what is the point of all this? It was fun. But also, we were able essentially to partition threats across the landscape and inform management based on that. I mean, sometimes informing a management decision isn't necessarily a very specific piece of information. It's kind of getting a thought process going in that organization, at least. Assess the utility of management across the metapopulation and the landscape. Expands the knowledge about the organism, obviously, and with any model, it identifies knowledge gaps. But more importantly, I believe, this was all coded in R and Python, and it's objective, it's data-driven, and it's iteratively reproducible. As Fred gave idea this morning, that's extremely important, at least for us. We need to be able to cite our methods, show our methods, and reproduce everything that we do. Thank you for your time. I'd just like to acknowledge the efforts of Hawaiian Endangered Species Recovery Project, Seabird Recovery Project, I always get that mixed up, the KSHCP, and collaborators with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Thank you. Oh, and if that was too complex for you, this is how it's organized, and this is how it all kind of comes together. Thank you. So the question was, is there any effort to mitigate for the strike, such as underlining the lines or in some other mitigation method? And there is ongoing efforts, given the current HCPs. They're looking at underlying specific portions of the lines, not all of them. They're also looking at developing these social attraction sites and exclusion fences around known colonies as well, but not to the level that we think it needs to be done, essentially. Interestingly, I mean, we're essentially using the predation threats to mitigate for the, I mean, as everything we do, we use the predation threats to mitigate for the anthropogenic threats, right? So we're essentially reducing those predation threats in certain colonies to attempt to mitigate for those anthropogenic threats.
I wasn't real clear, Adam, if for the strike data, it was interesting to understand how that's being recorded, but since that's not a visual, I assume that those are the only species that are known to be hitting the lines, or are there other confounding issues there?
No, there are definitely confounding issues for sure. I mean, the conservation metrics, conservation metrics algorithm, it primarily identifies strikes and non-strikes. From there, you have to ID kind of how many birds, what proportion of the species are Newells Shearwater versus Hawaiian petrel versus Banded Storm petrel. And the way we had to do it was actually give the proportion identified of the population of each. Right now, it's about, of those strikes, are about 80% Newells Shearwater.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam. Appreciate it.
Thank you.